A warm good evening to all the participants. I welcome you all to this session of J Mitra Scientific Seminar. I am Dr. Sharbhanu Ghosh and I am the Customer Relations Manager at J Mitra and Company. Today, carrying on the tradition of J Mitra Scientific Seminar, we do have this session on vector-borne diseases, and our distinguished speaker today is Dr. Suchitra Jain. Good evening, ma'am.
It's a real pleasure. Good evening, Mr. Ghosh. How are you? All fine, I hope?
Yeah, absolutely fine. And it's a real pleasure to have you on board today. And we look forward to hear from you on the cross-infection of malaria and dengue, which the monsoon at the crossroads.
Yeah.
So to all the participants, as usual, we will be having a technical session, and our distinguished speaker will give the presentation on this topic. So during the course of the session, you have any questions, please feel free to type in your questions and queries on the chat box, and we will take up at the end of the session. Also, I would request you all to keep the questions limited to the theme itself so that it becomes very easy for the speaker to attend to all the questions, and we will try to take as questions as possible. So just to give you a brief synopsis of Dr. Suchitra Jain. Dr. Jain completed her MBBS and MD in microbiology from Jain Medical College, Aligarh. And after that, she has been an NABL assessor, a certified training of NABH she has completed in 2016. And she has numerous certificates and fellowships to her credit. And her expertise lies in hospital management and administration. And currently, she's the clinical administrator and senior consultant in microbiology at Max Super Specialty Hospital in Patparganj. And today, we do have Dr. Jain to speak about cross infections between dengue and malaria. So without further any ado, Dr. Jain, the house is all yours. And I'm enabling the screen for you. Here you go.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosh. Thank you all. And I'd like to thank Dr. Neeraj and Mr. Ghosh for giving me this platform for this very relevant topic, which is the cross infections of malaria and dengue. So the thing is that as the season is coming, the cross infections for our COVID infections are very common, but today I would like to share the cross infections of malaria and dengue. This is usually a topic not so much known. Since 2015 we started having co-infection as the dengue cases rises as well as the malaria cases have risen, and that is why the need has arisen to look at a syndromic surveillance of cross infections as such, rather than just looking at one identity that if it is an acute febrile illness, then let's look either malaria or dengue or maybe many other arboviruses. So just give me a minute. I would like to open the screen for my, can you see now?
Yeah.
Can you see the shared screen or not?
Yes, ma'am, we can see that. Ma'am, you can go to the presentation.
Yeah, I'm trying to open that. Yeah. That is what I'm saying. Can you see now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, it's okay. So yeah. The topic is very relevant. As I said, that is a cross infection of malaria and dengue and better avenues in diagnostic approach. So I'll just brief the discussion that how it goes. The path to today's slide is, first I will introduce it, then incidence of dengue and malaria co-infections we will be talking about, clinical presentations and pathogenesis, then concurrent infections in pregnancy and other related ones. Then we'll go to host immune responses, co-infections, complications in co-infections, and the most important thing is how to diagnose that. What is the diagnostic dilemma we are dealing with when we are having one kind of infections, along with the some of the take-home messages. Now, both malaria and dengue, we all know, they are known to have a rapidly spreading mosquito-borne diseases, and it is of high importance in terms of both mortality and morbidity, posing a worldwide public health problem due to ease of globalized travel. So when the travelism has gone, not in the COVID, but actually before that, both the diseases had been taken on because they're mixed of endemic areas or mixed of populations. We started seeing the rise of malaria and dengue. We all know that malaria is a protozoan parasitic infection caused by Plasmodium species, which is usually transmitted by Anopheles species. And the major species infecting humans are these 5: Plasmodium falciparum, Vivax, ovale, Malariae, Plasmodium knowleski. That's the latest one which has come up. Just to brief, as I came to know some of the DNB students is also there, and we will refresh our knowledge about life cycle of Plasmodium. As we can see, in humans, malaria parasites grow and multiply first in the liver cells and then in red blood cells, RBC. The stages of parasite during the erythrocytic cycle are that cause of clinical symptoms of malaria. And with the gametocytes are picked up by female Anopheles, then during a blood meal, the sexual reproduction of the parasite begins in the gut. And the zygote develops from the fusion of the gametocyte, leading to the formation of oocyst and sporocyst in sequence. So this is the sequence which we have. Mosquito takes a blood meal, that is the first stage, and there is an erythrocytic cycle, there is an exoerythroid cycle, and then the gamete formation and the sporocyst in sequence. And after 18 to 20 days, the parasites are formed as sporozoites in the mosquito salivary glands. These sporozoites then infect another victim when the mosquito takes the next blood meal and the cycle starts again. So our infected sporozoite mosquito, when gives a bite to humans, then this cycle starts. So this is a very brief life cycle. We have all read in our classes that about amphibious classes that what is the life cycle, and this is very important since it shows erythrocytic and exoerythrocytic cycle also for recurrence of the infections. The life cycle of dengue to compare it. So the common thing here is mosquito. The species are both different. It causes Plasmodium is caused by Anopheles, whereas dengue is caused by Aedes aegypti. And dengue we know is a mosquito-borne disease against due to the infection of single-stranded RNA viruses, which have 4 serotypes are known, which is known as DEN 1, 2, 3, and 4 under the families Flaviviridae. Each of these serotypes is usually transmitted by Aedes aegypti. The typical transmission cycle of dengue follows human vector, human cycle, which is very similar to malaria. However, there is also a great potentiality for the dengue virus to shift from an animal transmission cycle to human transmission cycle. The DEN circulating in the human blood is ingested by blood female mosquitoes while feeding. And the virus gets infected and replicates in the mosquito midguts. So there's a, finally it infects, replicates in hemocoel and in the salivary glands of the mosquito. From the salivary glands, the virus is then transmitted to other humans during the succeeding feeding time. So you see that when mosquito infection takes place, this cycle is started. One is an intrinsic incubation cycle, and the other one is the extrinsic incubation cycle. Mosquito infection takes place when a blood meal from a person is with acute dengue, and extrinsic incubation takes place in the mosquito, which usually takes 8 to 10 days to travel to the salivary glands. Then one mosquito, it can bite several. The infected mosquito can transmit infection to many humans. And intrinsic infection, the onset of symptoms usually take 4 to 7 days. So life cycles are very different. One is caused by the parasite, the other one is caused by virus, though, but the thing is that both are caused by mosquitoes. So that is how the incidence of dengue and malaria co-infections can happen, because they can occur simultaneously in an individual because of the similarities in clinical characteristics of these two infections. The diagnosis of malaria and dengue co-infections is either misdiagnosed or misinterpreted. So what happens when usually a patient presents in a in an OPD or an IPD setup as an acute febrile illness, we usually we usually see the infection as mono-infections. Either we give, we usually say, okay, malaria, this is a season of malaria, so a malaria might be happening. Or if a dengue epidemic is going on, we will just try to see that it is a dengue, and we will not be seeing or looking, because an acute febrile illness will be caused and a diagnosis taken and we stop there. So that is not the case actually, and that is where what we are discussing today. As of today, there are many cases of malaria dengue co-infections which are reported from various regions in the world, following the first case which was reported in July 2015 in France. And there's a case report by Wadial. This was a case of fatal Plasmodium falciparum complicated by acute dengue fever, which was published in American Journal of Tropical Medicine in 2006. And it was very difficult to clinically differentiate, but the treatment of these co-infections are very different. So that has the importance, since it is clinically not differentiated, and the co-infection is common, and the treatment is, both the cases are very different. So a more need to identify these co-infections is very necessary. And what happens if there is a delay instituting any appropriate management, then the case can go into the fatality, or the mortality or morbidity will be high in both the cases. Clinical and biological pictures of co-infection cases are different from single infections, and bivariate comparisons show differences between malaria dengue and dengue between malaria dengue malaria. So we have to say, so there's a paper in 2012 which said that a match pair study was taken in France which had related many co-infections. Now coming to the clinical presentations and pathogenesis, clinical presentations of malaria and dengue are definitely similar, and that is why our problem is, though with the minor differences, the causative organism and the pathogenic organism I've already addressed. So what is the cause of misdiagnosis? Thrombocytopenia is a strong indicator of dengue fever, we all know, and it's associated with probability of both malaria and dengue. Both dengue and malaria are reported in thrombocytic patients, especially with acute febrile illness. So here, when a patient presents with thrombocytopenia, we should be looking at both. Anemia is a major symptom in malaria infections, which is again a consequence of blood stage causing intense intravascular hemolysis, we all know. However, anemia is common both in concurrent infections always. And what we have seen actually in the case report is that there is a significant decrease in platelets and hemoglobin content, and reduced aspartate aminotransferase levels and elevated alanine transferase is seen in concurrent infection. Now, this was published by Yasser et al. In 2014, which said that these are the very important findings. There is a significant, when a significant decrease in platelets occurs, it may possibility of not just dengue, but malaria should also be find out, and reduced aspartate aminotransferase level along with elevated aminotransferase level should be looked upon. Other clinical infestations in malaria are as myositis, we all know, rhabdomyolysis, and acute renal failure. And the postulated that in malaria, tumor necrosis factor increased blood viscosity, red cell saturation in skeletal muscles. Metabolic toxins released by parasite and lactic acidosis may cause myositis, skeletal muscle necrosis, and myoglobinuria. So this was published by S. Kumar in 2014, where rare concurrent infections along with scrub typhus, dengue, and malaria was reported in a very young female with fatal consequences. The first case of malaria and dengue co-infection in pregnancy was reported from a northern province of India, where 6-month pregnant female was admitted along with suspected malaria, which had along a co-infection of Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium falciparum, interestingly. And this report was published in 2016 in Medical Health Science Research. She was later diagnosed with dengue co-infection. So already 2 infections were there. And again, we were looking at was a 3rd infection, that is a dengue co-infection. And she recovered with fetal valving due to timely diagnosis. The doctors could diagnose and an appropriate management could be started in this case. This is just to show that how important it is for timely management and early diagnosis, which proved to be life-saving for mother and fetus in both the cases. In another study, which is done in Indian study, dengue in pregnancy, it is an underreported illness. And it was, again, with a special reference to the co-infection of both They were tested to rule out dengue infection, and dengue infection was found detected in 7.3 cases. Only 2 women had co-infections with malaria and dengue. The outcome of the patient of co-infection with dengue and Vivax malaria was later reported for the intrauterine death in the fetus when it was week 37 in this particular case study, which was published in 2015 by Asian Pacific General Medicine. There was another cross-sectional study, not in just Indian, but Brazilian Amazon, where Plasmodium vivax and dengue fever infection was taken, and it was published in 2014. And this study revealed that there's a predominant dengue serotypes in co-infected group for DEN-V, DEN2, and DEN4. So this was an infected pregnant woman with more severe complications comparison to in other co-infected patients. Similarly, there is also a publication of from again this where 11 hospitalized co-infected patients were taken and 2 pregnant with severe complications was reported. And this was when the WHO had marked that they were severe malaria criteria should also be looked for warning signs of severe dengue. So this was again changing in 2012 according to WHO. When this study was published, that you should be looking as a syndromic surveillance of cases in acute febrile illness. Now, what happens? Why this is important when malaria and dengue co-infection or other with acute, again with other infections are noted? There is a heightened levels of tumor necrosis factor. Thanks to this COVID, we all know what is interferons and what is tumor necrosis factor, not just microbiologists, but people, pathologists who are listening, they have now a very great knowledge of immunology. So not go into the detail, but there is definitely heightened levels of tumor necrosis factor interferon gamma, which has been systemically associated with increased clinical disease severity in both malaria and dengue fever in many case series. And this was published by Madoka VR, unraveling the patterns of human responses in Plasmodium vivax and dengue infection in 2015. So there's an increased TNF levels with significantly high numbers of interaction in the chemokines and cytokine networks, suggest that cytokinins may be involved in the pathogenesis of malaria and dengue fever comorbidity. Interleukin-6 has been implicated in the pathogenesis of severe dengue, and this cytokinin enhances the production of antiplatelet and induction of tissue plasmogen activator, leading to an increased risk of bleeding. These findings on immune markers support that co-infected cases present with severe inflammation and disease status compared to mono-infection. So the heightened level of TNF along with interleukin-6 is what gives the tumor necrosis factor, and interferon gives the severe co-infection mortality. Now, this circulating cytokinins and inflammatory markers can be used in biomarkers at early diagnosis. And as the immunopathogenesis produce complete multiple cytokinins inflammatory response while they regulate the spectrum of the infection, understanding the factors which may lead to increased morbidity and can lead to a better clinical prognosis. Now, immune response patterns of malaria and dengue co-infection, they are related to that co-individuals may produce higher co-infection concentration in interferon gamma, IL-6, and chemokinin, ligand 4, which is more common in mono-infective group. Now, this revealed that it exhibits a distinct immunoprofile with critical roles for TNF, IL-6, and interferon gamma. So this biomarkers can also be taken as lab diagnosis if we are having co-infection is preceded. Now, coming to diagnostic dilemma, what happens? The multiple infections in single case would drastically change the spectrum of clinical manifestations, which again complicates the diagnosis process. Then the number of reports from Asian countries, this was in concurrent infections with malaria, dengue, and hepatitis A virus together, where co-infections were there with these 2 agents. Then there was chikungunya, dengue, and malaria co-infections in traveler cases that's also been reported in 2015. Again, there are multiple overlapping clinical manifestation which posed a really serious diagnostic challenge that are endemic to tropical regions of Asia. and the many overlapping features and similarity of symptoms seen in patients with acute, such as high fever is seen, headache is seen in most of the cases, nausea and myalgia. Again, very signs of acute fever, which can happen in many other, not just malaria and dengue, but scrub typhus, typhus. There are other co-infections, chikungunya, in which these acute febrile illness can be presented. So, however, malaria is contrast to dengue. The trials of hematological findings, what we see is atypical lymphocytosis will be seen, hemoconcentration and thrombocytopenia might be a clue for differential diagnosis of dengue infection rather than just tropical infections, including malaria. However, we need to have an emphasis that concurrent malaria and dengue infections must be looked upon. So this was again emphasized by Asian Pacific Journal Biomedicine 2011 by Pickett et al. Now coming to the dilemma, in most of the cases, the dengue can be based on the detection of IgG antibody, where malaria is diagnosed by the microscopic examination of blood smear. So these are age-old methods which have been now using as isolation. Although IgM antibody titer using ELISA appears to be strongly positive for dengue, it can also be associated with malaria in many of the cases. And in some patients, IgM is detectable by the second and fourth symptom onset, while other patients, there is no detectable IgM antibody in 8th day, till the 8th day. And due to some false negative reactions are also observed in secondary infections, and small percentage cases, they may not be detectable IgM antibodies at all. So this was given by Abbasi et al., Clinical Features, Diagnostic Technique and Management of Dual Dengue and Malaria Infections in 2009 in General College in Physician Surgery. So, but what happens if the ELISA test is not available? There are a lot of rapid tests which are available, but we should assure that a good company is used for the detection of lateral flow assays, or we can say the rapid assays, which are available for qualitative detection of dengue, IgG, IgG. So I cannot emphasize much on this, that you should always be using an approved technique, approved kits whenever we are using a rapid antigen testing or rapid antibody testing methods. So ELISA test generally performs better, but if the ELISA facility is not available, in those cases, we can have these rapid tests. So a dengue IgM capture ELISA test can be performed following aridity to avoid presence of cross-reactivity among arbovirus, or which has also occurred in patients with leptospirosis, malaria, and even past dengue infection. So you can use a rapid test method, and if the time allows, we can give our sample for reference lab testing if the facility is available to further see that false positive or false negative reactions are not there. Nowadays, the other modalities also, so we can have NS1 antigen testing. As we can see, this is one of the kit in which antigen, IgM and IgG, we can test all the three. So NS antigen is in dengue, it is a notifiable disease as well as malaria. So we have to report NS1 antigen for our government facilities. And okay, there are kits available in which NS1 antigen, IgM, IgG, both can be used. Okay, on the left hand side, there is just dengue IgG. On the above, there is a kit which shows NS1 antigen along with IgM and IgG. So there's a control line, there's a test line, and where we can get the test. There's a sample flow window in which we can put our sample, and within 15 to 20 minutes, we will get the test. Same way, the dengue rapid test kit, it is test 1, test. There are 2 lines, sample well is there, diluent well is there, and a control line. So we should know and interpret our rapid diagnostic test, that a control line is a must, then only we approve the test, and the line should be clear whenever we are going for the diagnosis by the rapid testing kits, detection kits. And what happens now? On day 2 or 3, NS1 antigen can be positive, as I told you, and in last slide also, still IgM is detectable by 2nd to the 4th day from the symptoms, while in other patients it is not sometimes available in 8th day, and there could be false positivity also. Now, these days, PCR for dengue is also performed to rule out any infections. So there are many kits available. Many companies are providing PCR kits where dengue and chikungunya can be combined in their cases, or a simple dengue fever can also be. And so this has got more specificity and sensitivity than rapid antigen test, definitely. And it is also much better advocated than ELISA tested. So PCR is much more in these days for the detection of dengue. This is what it was shown that from an endemic area of Peru, where clinical characteristics and positive frequency for RT-PCR, serology of NS antigen and IgG-IgM was taken from International Journal of Infectious Disease in 2019. And this shows that 199 tests were negative and 69. So we can see the positivity rate was definitely higher in RT-PCR frequency than NS1 antigen and compared to IgM and IgG. Now coming to malaria, the age-old method is definitely that both thick and thin film remains the gold standard for confirmation, and we should train our pathologists, technicians, that how to make a thin and thick and thin slide in the same. It is very, very good technique. Still, if there is a good pathologist or a microbiologist, definitely this is still the mainstay for diagnosis of malaria, because thick film is more sensitive in detecting malaria parasites due to higher concentrated blood, which allows a large volume of blood to be examined, and thin film allows parasite species detection. And it is important that once the Plasmodium is detected, a blood film for malaria parasite test on Plasmodium vivax is performed daily while the patient is in hospital, then weekly for 4 weeks during follow-ups, and finally monthly for 11 months during the follow-ups. And we know the reason why. And if the expertise is not available for thick and thin film blood smear examination, definitely we can use rapid detection tests, which are based on detection of circulating parasitic antigens, and this should be used if microscopy is not available. Or concurrently, we can also use rapid tests along with thin and blood smear. If it is negative, what we do is, if it is negative, then the patients with malarial infestations, a series of bloods should be examined at 6 to 12 intervals, and or RTDs can be used. This utilizes, then there are different RTDs which are available. So it utilizes histidine-rich protein 2, which only detects Plasmodium falciparum, whereas the parasite lactate dehydrogenase and aldose-based tests can detect both gametocytes and malaria parasites. Hence, there is a variability of performance of these tests for non-falciparum, which is usually recommended. And it was also recommended by WHO, protecting our health from climate change. There's also a training course available, and which in chapter 2, vector-borne diseases, and under vector-borne disease, both the diseases are given. You can have a look there. One of the concerns of this rapidly test is the failure to detect high parasite densities due to the absence of histidine-rich protein in certain malaria parasite, which leads to negative results, as it was presented a case of Plasmodium falciparum complicated by acute dengue fever in East Timor. This was a very famous case where the patient died, and this was published in 2006 in the American Journal of Medical. Why this happens actually? This is because in endemic areas, malaria and dengue infections can exist in the same patient. Although malaria and dengue can have quite similar symptoms and signs, the treatment of these two illnesses are very different. And any suspicion of malaria and disease endemic areas must be excluded with microscopy or rapid antigen tests, and also viral isolation where the facilities are available. These are usually for the research purpose only. And molecular test of paired serology in such co-infection episodes are also reliable. Now, failure to recognize malaria and dengue co-infections, which will delay in the initiation of proper therapy. I've not gone into the detail of management of treatment, But just to brief, the malaria anti-malarial drugs are available: chloroquine and primethamine, pyrimethamine. These are the malarial drugs, whereas in case of dengue, just the hydration therapy is the most important. Say no antibiotics is instituted in that case, and sometimes if it is infected by some bacterial infections, then only antibiotics are prescribed. So the main stay of treatment for both the cases are very different. And that is why if we ignore one, it will land up in the fatality cases or increased mortality and morbidity cases, as in malaria and dengue infections. Again, in Indian Academy of Neurology, this was published in 2011. And this fatal case of co-infection, which I was telling, was with Plasmodium falciparum malariae and dengue in East Timor. Due to delayed diagnosis of malaria with malaria, RTD serve as a reminder for fallibility. Again, so false negative test was given, and that is why the importance of parasitological diagnosis through microscopy is the most important thing. If we can initiate the antimicrobial therapy in the cases which are not detected by your thick and thin smear. Now, coming to conclusions and recommendations, one of the major reasons for less common incidence of concurrent infection may be due to different specific mosquito vectors and their habitats. But now, because of the globalized trade happens, these infections are increasing. The habitat of vector for malaria is in forest, whereas the habitat for vector of dengue is in urban locations. And now because of mix again, that is what I'm been emphasizing, though it happened to be a forest cycle malaria, and it has to be more dengue to be connected with urban populations. Due to the mix of these two populations, we are seeing the rise in cases, especially in Asian countries. Now, this co-infection is also thought to be exposure to two different mosquito vectors at a given time. So if both the species of mosquitoes, say Aedes aegypti as well as Anopheles, it happens in the same geographical location, the possibility of co-infection is very, very high in those cases. And the immunity of each infection can also be an endemic area, is also a possible factor. We know there are certain areas where Plasmodium does not exist, and there the dengue infections might also not there. So however, the actual number of incidences is probably underestimated in areas due to highly endemic for both malaria and dengue as a developing countries in tropical belt in Asia, which was again new World Health Organization said how can protect our health from climate change. It is possible that actual number of incidences is not diagnosed or not documented. These are sometimes underreported cases that we are not diagnosing, or diagnostic facility was not available, or they were the other factors like only one infection was noted, the other infections due to better immune response could have been got unnoticed. So these are, that is why the actual number of incidents are still not diagnosed or not documented. The concurrent infections, that is why they are easily forgotten. And when one underlying cause is diagnosed in acute febrile illness, the possibility of other infections is usually not taken into consideration. What happens if, say, a malaria and dengue has existed and an anti-malarial drug was started? Usually the symptoms, they start decreasing, usually the patient also thinks that he's improving, and it might not care of dengue in that case. If the hydration was possible, then maybe it did not manifested as a co-infection, and just one of the infection was manifested in that cases. Now that is why the possible causes of all febrile illness should be ruled out in endemic to the specific region with the latest and approved method available. So I cannot emphasize much that whenever acute febrile illness happens and a patient comes up to us, a syndromic surveillance should be taken in that case. So just the take-home messages here: the concurrent infection of malaria and dengue, though seldom reported, is showing increase in incidence in these diseases. Endemic countries in Asia, even with scarce reports, the co-infection have been recently recognized as a clinical problem, and the possibility of concurrent infection in cases of atypical clinical manifestations of acute febrile illness and early diagnosis is the key. I would not, I will emphasize again that early the treatment which can be life-saving. And there's also great need to increase the awareness of this concurrent infection, as it has been rightly done through this platform among physicians and other healthcare personnel, that there's also a need to report these incidences. And development of new diagnostics like PCR of dengue is available, or a single test format where antigen antibody can be detected in one single go, or our rapid detection test for if a thick and thin smear cannot be examined. Rapid antigen kit is available, rapid antibodies are available, so we can go for those rapid tests, but our diagnosis should be made and by all the methods which are available, and the implementation of public engagement programs for prevention and control of these mosquito transmitted infections should also be warranted. So without prevention and control of vector-borne diseases, this won't be possible, and we will keep seeing the rise in cases of dengue and malaria, both if we are not careful, along with again the other things. So this is all from my side. And,
well, ma'am, it was really what you can say, a very descriptive and I would say well articulated presentation, because I could hardly find a single slide where you have not mentioned the particular reference. So it was well documented, I would say. Definitely, there are what you can say multiple avenues where we have to look forward to. There are definitely few questions which are lined up. The first and foremost thing is that people are asking, like, what would be the effect of a discrete monsoon pattern, what we observe these days? Okay, and this year, the reports have been said that this has been the laziest monsoon. So if we have to really take in consideration with the monsoon outbreaks, how would you consider it would take a, what you can say, effect on the epidemiology of the cross infections?
So definitely, as you rightly said, the monsoon is late in onset, but today only I diagnosed 2 cases of malaria. So the cases have started rising again since it is late in monsoon. So we may see a co-infection that much, because the pattern is the first, the malaria had since along in July and August, and then we see the rise of cases in September, say, of dengue cases, which still there. So there's a period here, say, between September, late July and early September, or September, where we might come across some of the infections. But the my point here is that whenever we have an acute febrile illness, we should be looking at both. So the monsoons had set in. So I would answer the question, yes, we will be seeing some of the rise, not like COVID. Hopefully the third wave doesn't come and it gets superseded, and we have, but definitely there will be co-infections once the monsoon is more showers coming to this area. We are
there is a possibility that people are saying that we already had what you can say, we know the classical symptoms of both malaria and dengue, but unfortunately to actually pinpoint the accurate stage where we actually find that the co-infection is existing, at that particular stage, what would be the channelized mode of treatment?
So for dengue, we all know the hydration is the key. Okay, so there is no per se a treatment for dengue if we keep looking at hydration part, if you're talking about treatment. Okay, and but yes, anti-malarial therapy is the key. So we have to institute both. Whenever acute malarial patient comes to us, we should be looking at anti-malaria drugs and also looking at a part of hydration, which will cover our dengue infection also. So that is how we should take it. But yes, we should be able to diagnose. That is what if that answer corrects you.
Yeah.
Is that what you are trying to find out?
Yeah, I think that answers pretty much the whole gambit of the question. The other thing what people have highlighted is that in one of your slides, you have mentioned that the vulnerable group are the pregnant women, and that has been well documented by the various publications. Yeah. But as in our country, we do have many other like pockets and incidences which are underreported also. So they are asking, like, apart from pregnant women, what would be the next vulnerable group, like, which should be kept under monitoring?
So definitely, because as you say, pregnancy is vulnerable patient age, then the more vulnerable group will be the children, basically. where we should be taking care of, because what happens is dehydration goes unnoticed and they might land up in a lot of complications. In that case, the other group is children where infection is there. Then the other will be the extremes of age. They are important for these complications again for looking forward to.
There is a follow-up to this one. They are saying that this has been the what you can say the standard practice. But in a post-COVID scenario, would you highlight any particular age group or any particular what you can say domain where they have to actually look out for cross infections?
Yeah, so we all know during COVID infection, there is always a rise in IL-6. Okay, so there's an increased host response which we found in case of this COVID. So, and because the co-infections also is giving rise to that particular tumor necrosis factors and IL-6, that is important, and where the cytokine storm is seen. So if there is a COVID infection and there's a co-infection, then definitely that group becomes vulnerable along with post-COVID infection.
And,
so because the immune response is being modulated by the same IL-6 group, interferon gamma, and tumor necrosis factors, which will again play in the role of these co-infections also. And same happens in case of response to COVID people.
Actually, I do have a follow-up question to this. Now, since you have mentioned about IL-6, from a diagnostic approach, I would just like to understand that other than the routine diagnosis, which is taking place for both these vector-borne diseases, do you really recommend that IL-6 should also be tested for the COVID
in one
scenario?
of the sites, though, there are no documented or approved strategy which has come for co-infections. But definitely one of the study which I have highlighted in one of the slides is that biomarkers can be looked in case of concurrent infections. There can be a possibility, but still it is still not being used. So let's hope that if a co-infection comes and a strategic diagnostic method of using biomarkers also come into play. Because definitely the responses there are a lot of publications which are saying about the host immune response in a concurrent infection is marked increase, which should be detectable by our biomarkers.
In one of your slides, Dr. Jain, you have mentioned that the fatality has been documented with respect to Plasmodium falciparum, especially in East Timor. Okay. Now, is there any incidence or on your understanding, do you highlight any particular species which can cause mortality in cross-infection in India?
So Plasmodium falciparum definitely is there. Then Nolensky is the new strain which has come. Maybe, but yes, it can have the fatal sequences in case.
And will the mortality incidence, I mean to say, vary from pocket to pocket, or it will depend upon the age group? How it would vary? Like
it definitely depends on the species and age group, both combined.
Okay. Yeah. And the final question from this particular part is that with respect to the COVID syndrome over here in total, now there are two groups. One are the COVID recovered patients. Okay. If at all we do happen to have cross-infection of these diseases in these, what would be your advice to them?
Couldn't get it. In post-COVID infections, you're saying?
Yeah.
So the protection is the mainstay. We have to stay in COVID. Like we have to be in the inwards, and the mosquito control, that is important. So in post-COVID scenario, again, in a COVID patients, we should use all the protective methods for vector control in that case. So that is all what I could think of. Otherwise, it is just a futuristic question in sense that we will see how the monsoon behaves and how the COVID behaves. Since we are still learning about the COVID, we never know what will be the cross infections with other infections. We have seen rise in many other infections along with COVID and multiple organ failures also, but it's time to see. But yes, definitely in COVID patients, we should have a better vector control in those areas where COVID patients are residing right now.
There is one participant who is asking that how would we differentiate COVID and dengue clinically? And is there any possibility that it can coexist?
Yeah, it do coexist. And as I said, it could be in thrombocytopenic patients. One of the slides, I think, has answers that question, thrombocytopenia. Then there is an elevated AST and a decreased AST response in those cases. So we should be looking at the markers, enzyme markers also in case of co-infection, along with decreased anemia, thrombocytopenia and anemia, highly, and platelet restrictions. And definitely the mainstay, what I would say is like that where RT-PCR is available for many diseases along, like we have dengue, chikungunya, again in RT-PCR available. And some of the labs have also introduced many multiple for acute febrile illness, the syndromic surveillance. That is the key to the infections now. And as the year progresses, we will see more of these tests coming up, where they combine these tests for have a better diagnostics and to initiate the treatment as soon as possible, because the treatment in most of the cases varies. The antibiotics differ in cases, the anti-malarial and the other therapies. So that is how it should be.
And you have been advocating about the use of PCR techniques for, I mean to say, extensively, and people have been asking, like, nevertheless, there are many kits which are available for PCR, especially for dengue. They have one question is that, will these kits be able to detect between the serotypes of dengue?
Yeah, dengue serotypes. Yes, we are able to detect serotypes. There are kits available. There are approved kits available where serotypes can be done now in newer kits which are available. So we can use those methods.
And last but not the least, they are saying that there has been this outbreak of dengue almost every 4 years in this country. And the last was documented probably in 2016 and 17.
Yeah.
Now, we haven't seen that kind of an outbreak. Now, we already are living in a condition of a pandemic. Now, do you really think that we can actually come to a position that dengue might come to that kind of a outbreak? And if it happens, what would be the chances between the host and virus competition?
Okay, so we have seen whenever a new virus enters a human cycle, it is novel, it is naive, and we learn through it. So before that, it was H1N1 also. We have seen the whole pandemic. Now we are seeing COVID. And whenever it is introduced, a new virus is introduced in a human cycle. We all know from a different cycle. So this was a cycle which was happening in for a syllabic cycle we have seen, and then the urban population shift has been there. So whenever a virus is introduced from the other environment to a human cycle, the response is exaggerated. We will see a lot of masses coming up, and as this happened in case of dengue also. And as the seasons, after seasons, we learn more, better techniques are available for the detection, the better initiation of the treatment can be done. As we pass, we keep on learning through that, and so the cases keep coming down. And that is why we are seeing that after 4 years, so this is a cycle which happened. We have seen it in so many, once the dengue will come, and then the malaria will come in the next year. But here I'm talking about the co-infection, not a single dengue to be there or a malaria to be there. I am talking about the co-infections now exist in this mixed globalized population. That is what I am emphasizing today. That concurrent infections may be not just dengue and malaria. We should be looking at scrub typhus also. We should be looking at rickettsial infections also. We should be looking at other syndromic typhoid also. Definitely, we have seen a lot of cases along with co-infections of COVID and typhoid. So I'm talking here about concurrent infection, which should always be kept in mind when we are looking at acute febrile illness. Whether it will be coexisting, COVID will be coexisting with dengue, or COVID will be existing with malaria, it's yet to see. Since it's 4 years cycle, or maybe after 2 years, what from my experience, it's usually the alternate years it is happening in dengue, and then malaria happens, and dengue and malaria. So last time it was malaria, so maybe we see first, this time dengue, and we never know.
I think
it all depends on which species of mosquito is breeding in what particular area, and that is what we are looking at.
So I think both the comorbidity as well as mortality will be decided by the mosquitoes themselves, and not by the not by the anthropologic factors.
That is the species of Anopheles is breeding in that area, or species of Aedes aegypti is breeding, and COVID, along with COVID infection, the response has to be host-induced immune response. This is what should be.
Yeah, and I cannot agree more with you with the take-home message which you have said, that early diagnosis is definitely key to everything. Yeah. And I really wish that certain conditions like this should not arise, God forbid. And the only thing is that, yes, what you have advocated to is quite right, that we have to be very much vigilant as far as the clinical fraternity is concerned, that they have to be able to identify the patients randomly. I mean to say, we cannot blame everyone, because obviously we do have caseloads coming in, so increased pay. But nevertheless, it was a wonderful presentation, Dr. Jan.
So one thing more, sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Along with the kids diagnostic clinicians, the role of governmental agencies, like we have spread about the COVID also, the measures about the participations from the people engagements, that is to take control of them, like vector mosquito control in every society or every residential societies, they will be taking care. And this will all contribute whether we have those infections again or not. So that needs to also be public awareness along with clinicians awareness is more important if we are looking at this.
I presume that there might be some participants who are from the government agencies must be listening to your suggestions over here. Nevertheless, definitely this last point actually covers the whole gambit of it, because we all are partners in this particular effort of what you can say bridging the gap between the surveillance and treatment. And I think everyone, all of over here, including you and me and all the participants, are definitely putting in their effort to close this gap as we speak. But yes, I think more needs to be studied and documented. And I cannot thank you enough for all the publications which you have highlighted. And I think people have been very much, what you can say, being enlightened by this particular presentation. So before I conclude, just allow me to present you our token of appreciation to you, madam. And here is your certificate of appreciation. I am just presenting you in virtual mode, but very shortly I will be presenting you in person. But yes, thank you, Dr. Jan, for all your time and effort. And
delivery, like we should be advocating, still not sure about the COVID. So it's better.
Well, obviously, nobody can say that they are expert in this particular management. Definitely not. But yes, there are loads of avenues where we are open to what you can say, get educated. And I mean to say, like what I said, that we have to be what you can say mutual enough to understand what the diagnosis is. Yeah. We have to look into all the suggestions which are coming and pouring in from different quarters. And what you have also mentioned with respect to the endemic pockets. Yeah. If these endemic pockets are constant, then we have nothing to worry. But if they are changing, then definitely it would be a what you can say catastrophic effect. And also what you have highlighted with respect to the species. So they play an important role. So we have to be very vigilant to what is cropping up. So definitely. So on that note, I would just say that, yes, Dr. Jan, it was a meaningful lecture. It was a meaningful session.
Thank you for giving such a platform and so many participants. I hope I'm able to answer those questions, and you can share my email if there are still more questions. I'm happy to.
I will be definitely coordinating on the take-home message itself, and we will be definitely partnering up again with you sometime soon. And till then, to all the participants, please stay tuned for many more lectures coming up in this season. And we will be keeping everyone atop with all the information from our social media handle. So till then, thank you, Dr. Jan, and thank you to all the participants.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And have a nice evening. Bye.